17. That's the chilling number of young men and boys whose lives were brutally cut short by Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, a name synonymous with evil. Each victim had a story, a life full of potential, dreams and aspirations that were cruelly snuffed out. 17 souls, their futures stolen, their bodies desecrated in ways that defy comprehension. Families left in perpetual mourning, communities shattered by the loss of their loved ones. Dahmer's reign of terror spanned over a decade, leaving an indelible mark on the city of Milwaukee and the nation. The fear and horror he instilled in the community were palpable, a dark cloud that lingered long after his capture. His crimes, a grotesque tapestry of murder, necrophilia, cannibalism, and dismemberment, shocked the world. The sheer brutality and inhumanity of his actions were beyond anything the public could fathom. Dahmer's gruesome acts weren't merely acts of violence, they were a descent into the darkest recesses of the human psyche, a terrifying glimpse into the abyss of human depravity. His actions forced society to confront the uncomfortable reality of such evil existing among us. These weren't just crimes of passion or moments of madness, they were meticulously planned and executed acts of horror. Dahmer's methodical approach to his heinous acts revealed a chilling level of premeditation and control. Dahmer lured his victims, many of them from marginalized communities, with promises of companionship or money. His ability to exploit the vulnerabilities of these individuals added another layer of cruelty to his already monstrous deeds. He drugged them, tortured them, and ended their lives in the most gruesome ways imaginable. The horror of his actions was compounded by the trust he betrayed, the innocence he destroyed. The sheer brutality and calculated nature of his crimes begged the question, what could drive a human being to commit such atrocities? Psychologists and criminal profilers have long studied Dahmer's case, trying to understand the mind behind the madness. How could someone like Jeffrey Dahmer, seemingly ordinary on the surface, harbor such monstrous darkness within? His ability to blend into society, to appear normal, made his crimes all the more terrifying. It was a stark reminder that evil can lurk behind the most unassuming facades. Born in 1960, Jeffrey Dahmer seemed like an ordinary child from an unremarkable family in Wisconsin. Yet, beneath the surface of normalcy lurked a darkness that would eventually consume him. He was described by some as a quiet and withdrawn child, while others recalled a macabre fascination with death from a young age. Dahmer's interest in the morbid reportedly began in early childhood with a fascination with animal bones. He would collect roadkill, dismembering and dissolving animal carcasses in a macabre foreshadowing of his future crimes. As a teenager, Dahmer grappled with his sexuality, harboring an attraction to men that he felt unable to express openly. At the same time, his morbid fascinations grew, intertwining with his burgeoning sexuality in a dangerous and disturbing way. His social awkwardness and increasingly bizarre behavior alienated him further, pushing him further into isolation. This isolation, coupled with his suppressed desires and morbid curiosities, created a volatile cocktail that would ultimately explode in a horrific act of violence. To understand the monster Dahmer became, we must delve into the psychological labyrinth of his mind. Experts have posthumously diagnosed Dahmer with several severe mental disorders, including borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and paraphilia. These conditions, left untreated, likely contributed to his distorted perceptions, his inability to form healthy relationships, and his descent into a world of fantasy and control fueled by his dark obsessions. Societal issues also played a role in Dahmer's ability to operate undetected for so long. Many of his victims were young men of color, marginalized and often overlooked by society. This tragic reality allowed Dahmer to operate in the shadows, preying on the vulnerable with impunity. His crimes exposed the systemic inequalities and prejudices that allowed his victims to become invisible, their disappearances unnoticed until it was far too late. It was a chilling reminder that society's most vulnerable are often the most susceptible to predators lurking in the shadows. Dahmer's early life was marked by instability and a sense of detachment. Born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, his childhood was outwardly unremarkable, but signs of trouble were apparent to those who looked closely. His mother, plagued by mental health issues, struggled to provide a stable environment. His father, a chemist, was often absent, leaving young Jeffrey feeling isolated and adrift. Some experts believe that this lack of parental warmth and guidance contributed to Dahmer's emotional detachment and inability to form genuine connections. School offered little solace for the increasingly withdrawn Dahmer. He struggled to make friends, and was bullied for his perceived awkwardness and eccentricities. He found solace in solitary pursuits, like dissecting roadkill and collecting animal bones, his fascination with death growing with each passing year. By his teenage years, Dahmer was using alcohol to numb his growing feelings of isolation and inadequacy. His fantasies, fueled by pornography and alcohol, took a sinister turn, his morbid curiosity about death intertwining with his burgeoning sexuality in a dangerous and disturbing way. The summer after his high school graduation, Dahmer's dark fantasies bled into reality. It was a time of transition, a period when most young people are filled with hope and dreams for the future. But for Dahmer, it marked the beginning of a descent into darkness. With his parents going through a bitter divorce and his father away on business, Dahmer was left alone in the family home, his isolation complete. The once lively house now echoed with silence, amplifying his loneliness and inner turmoil. The absence of parental supervision gave him the freedom to explore his darkest desires. It was during this time that he encountered 18-year-old Stephen Hicks, a young man hitchhiking to a concert. The rural roads of Ohio were quiet and the chance meeting seemed almost fated. Hicks, unaware of the danger, accepted Dahmer's offer for a ride, seeking nothing more than a bit of company and a lift to his destination. Dahmer lured Hicks back to his house with the promise of beer and company. The allure of a cold drink and friendly conversation was enough to convince Hicks to follow Dahmer into the secluded home. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken intentions. Plying the young man with alcohol, Dahmer engaged in sexual activity with Hicks before, in a moment of panic, bludgeoning him to death with a barbell. The act was sudden, violent, and irreversible. Dahmer's fantasies had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The room, once filled with the sounds of forced laughter and clinking bottles, now fell silent, save for Dahmer's heavy breathing. Overwhelmed by panic and horror, Dahmer dismembered Hicks's body, dissolving the remains in acid and scattering the bones in the woods behind his house. Each step of the gruesome process was a desperate attempt to erase the evidence of his crime. The forest, once a place of childhood play, became a graveyard for his dark secret. The act, far from repulsing him, seemed to ignite a dark spark within Dahmer, awakening a gruesome hunger that would lay dormant for nearly a decade. The thrill of the kill, the power over life and death, left an indelible mark on his psyche. He stared at his reflection, grappling with the monster he had become. Plagued by guilt and fear, Dahmer attempted to bury the memory of his crime in alcohol and fleeting attempts at normalcy. He frequented bars, seeking solace at the bottom of a bottle, but the shadows of his actions loomed large. Each drink was a futile attempt to drown out the haunting memories. He briefly attended Ohio State University, then enlisted in the Army, all the while battling the dark urges that simmered within him. The structured life of the military provided a temporary reprieve, but the darkness within him was never far behind. His attempts to lead a normal life were overshadowed by the ever-present specter of his past. Following his dishonorable discharge from the Army, Dahmer moved back to Milwaukee, a city that would soon become the backdrop for his horrifying acts. His dark compulsions, which had been simmering beneath the surface, resurfaced with a vengeance. From 1987 to 1991, these compulsions drove him to commit unspeakable acts. Dahmer embarked on a terrifying spree of violence, leaving a trail of devastation in his wake. Claiming the lives of 16 more young men, each victim was a tragic loss, their potential futures brutally cut short. He meticulously honed his methods, luring his victims with promises that masked his sinister intentions, many of whom were gay or bisexual men of color, a community often marginalized and overlooked. Dahmer would invite them back to his apartment, offering money or companionship as bait. Once there, he would drug their drinks, often rendering them unconscious and helpless. Before engaging in horrifying acts of torture, his actions driven by a twisted need for control. Murder and dismemberment followed, each act more gruesome than the last. Dahmer's apartment became a macabre abattoir, a place where nightmares became reality. Filled with the instruments of his gruesome rituals, chemicals for dissolving flesh, power tools for dismemberment, and a refrigerator used to store human remains, a chilling testament to his depravity. Driven by a perverse desire to possess and control his victims, Dahmer's actions knew no bounds. He engaged in necrophilia and cannibalism, acts that defied human comprehension and morality. attempting to preserve his victims in ways that were as grotesque as they were unimaginable. Astonishingly, Dahmer managed to evade detection for years, his crimes hidden behind a facade of normalcy. His friendly demeanor and unassuming appearance allowed him to blend into society seamlessly. His heinous acts were fueled by societal indifference towards his victims, who were often marginalized. His apartment, reeking of decay, went largely unnoticed by neighbors and landlords, a testament to the chilling ease with which a monster could hide in plain sight, undetected and unchallenged. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is a grim reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind a mask of normalcy and the tragic consequences of societal neglect.